This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. G'day, I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Claire Kimball. Kate, our Newsmakers series has come to a close, and first and foremost, we wanted to say thank you to anyone who tuned in.
Yeah, a big thank you. And if you're someone who's been meaning to listen, just scroll through this feed. All the episodes are available. Just to recap, the reason for doing Newsmakers was, like everything we do at the Squiz, primarily to inform. More than that though, what we really wanted to bring you was the stories behind the people that make the news, and particularly the ones that I admire, Claire, because what they do is share a thoughtfulness about the big issues and a curiosity about the world, and importantly for us, an ability to see different perspectives.
Yeah, and I think you've absolutely achieved that. And we're receiving feedback, particularly like this. It's very hard to deny that you've done that. So one listener wrote in regarding your conversation with Chris Uhlmann. What they said is the chat was insightful, entertaining, informed and genuine. Importantly, it was conversational, but one loaded with goodness for me as a listener to take away.
We've definitely picked out the best review we got, but there was a lot along that theme, and we're really pleased that that's where it landed for so many of you. We did cover a lot of topics: hospitality and culture, local news, sport, lifestyle, politics, business, women, and then a surprise newsmaker at the end, Dr. Carl, with science.
Yeah, and let's go through it. We can put some names to those topics. So you had Nick Shelton, the founder of Broadsheet, Claire Stutchbury, who's the head of the local and independent news association. There was Chris Uhlmann, who of course is one of our most esteemed political editors. There was Murray Shaw, who was the executive producer of our Olympics coverage, and Kerry Elstob, who's head of Nine's websites. Also John McDouling, who's the editor of the new kid on the block, Capital Brief.
Yeah, and then the series finished with interviews with Mia Friedman, which was a huge get her to come on. She's obviously the founder of Mamma Mia. And I don't know how to describe Lee Sales except for unrivaled, because she's Lee Sales. I mean, it's Lee Sales.
Say
and as
no
I
more.
said, we finished with the extraordinary Dr. Carl. They all had different things to offer. But as you and I reflected on the conversations, there's some common themes, Claire.
Yep, there is some common themes, so it's a good way to structure these conversations. Let's step through our main takeaways from the series.
Can't wait. Let's do it. Over the next few weeks, News Club is partnering with Go2 Skincare, because luxe skincare that actually works and doesn't break the bank is our kind of thing. Not so coincidentally, it's Go2's thing too. Find your go-to at go2skincare.com. Claire, my takeaway number one primarily was the commitment and passion of all of these people to what they do. They were driven by a higher purpose. They are driven by a higher purpose. And for most, that was the truth. So it's this idea that journalism for them is not their job, it's their vocation.
Yeah, exactly right. And let's start with Chris Uhlmann. It's a good place to start because he studied to be a priest, which is probably the vocation of all vocations.
Yes.
But he did find his way into journalism, and he told you this story.
When did it click that this was the thing that you should be doing?
You know, one of the priests in the seminary, a guy called Jimmy Esler, who was a tremendous canon lawyer, and what had happened before he studied in the same year, I think, as Gough Whitlam, so going back a very, very long way. And he had been hopeless at everything, he said, but then he found the law and couldn't do it badly. And it was one of those things, when I got into journalism, I found that it just felt like a natural fit to me.
He came to it quite late in life, actually. He was into his 30s when he became a journalist, and he's since become very committed to journalism and how we do it, and the commentary even around the media. He spoke specifically about the role of the media during the pandemic, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But first, I have to go to Mia Friedman, because you cannot get someone more committed to content than Mia Friedman.
I'm an absolute monster for content. I cannot get enough content, you know. When I was growing up, I loved magazines, but the magazines I loved, which were like Dolly, Cosmo, Clio, when I got a bit older, they only came out once a month, and that wasn't enough. So I would buy everything from Women's Weekly to just everything, Women's Day, New Idea. Like I'd buy everything because I just loved the medium and I loved content. I could never get enough of it.
And as you said, Mia was such a great get because she does rarely do interviews. How did you find speaking with her?
Yeah, she's someone who's like so available but so unavailable for interviews like this. So we were really thrilled when she said yes. I found her to be immediately familiar. She sort of has this way of being your best girlfriend very quickly, and I hadn't met her before, so I found that really interesting. She's just so good at what she does, which is content. Everything she said we could have clipped up and made into a reel, and it would have, been really interesting for the audience. She's also easily vulnerable, and we talked a lot about this in our conversation. She talked about how hard that can be emotionally for her. And just on her audience and how she's so connected to them, and Mamma Mia is all about making the world a better place for women and girls. She raised the issue of school hours for working parents and how 9 to 3 just doesn't work. That certainly got a lot of traction, Claire.
Yeah, it really did hit the mark, including for our audience. And look, she said that was her number one message for policymakers. How do we actually rethink this space to allow more women to engage with the workforce and whatever else it is that they want to get on with in their lives?
Moving on to takeaway number 2, most of our guests are naturally optimistic.
Who would have thought, right? Yes, they really were. And I really liked how you structured that interview to ask that question as you got towards the end.
That was your favourite question, I think. You always said to me, what did they say about being hopeful?
Yeah, because I'm looking for proof points too, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And look, Nick Shelton, of course, from Broadsheet, his publication really does focus on the hospitality sector and community news, and his response really stood out to me. He spent much of the interview explaining how tough the pandemic had been for that hospitality and arts sector. And just when it started to come back, cost of living crunch. So here's his views.
And I'm hopeful across the board. So I'm hopeful that the consumer confidence, cost of living, inflation, all these sort of metrics that are important soften, and that we can go back to growth, and we can go back to sort of putting our shoulders back and our head up and saying, okay, we've got some confidence, and we're going out and we're sort of, building our economy and building our businesses and living life in sort of a positive state rather than a sort of defensive state, which is what we're seeing at the moment, I think.
So it's that idea that things come and go, that there's cycles to everything. I think that's a really comforting thought. On a lighter note, Kerry Elstub of Nine, she runs all of Nine's websites, reminded me that when it comes to news, often what we click on and read about is not the intense, hard news topics. For example, she mentioned that their number one news article across the previous month from when she came in was why not to tie a ribbon to a suitcase.
And Kate, you can't just leave us hanging on that.
I know. We did leave you hanging in the podcast. The reason why, it's not because they get caught, it's because the bag scanning technology can get confused. If it gets confused, your bag just might not end up on the plane.
Something really good to know, right?
Practical advice.
Yeah, and look, on practical advice around the news and optimism, Lee Sales had some really interesting things to say, and of course she's done a whole lot around grief as well.
Yeah, so she wrote a whole book which is called Any Ordinary Day, about grief and about the news. She talks to people who we all know from the news who have experienced deep and sudden trauma and how they cope. So I wanted to ask her particularly about news fatigue, because it's something we hear about a lot from news consumers more broadly.
Yeah, and Lee herself has even done speeches in the last year about her move from 7:30 and news fatigue in her personal life, but also addressing it as a topic as a whole for many, many Australians. When we do surveys, we do hear a little bit about that. Of course, the news is, a lot of it recounting some really terrible things that happen in the world, and the reaction from many is, I don't want to see it. I don't want to be anything close to that. I want to tune out. So here she is on that topic.
But the other thing is, when you're watching the news, the nature of the news is it is going to emphasise the least likely thing to happen to you. So, for example, when I was at university, we were taught 100 helicopters might fly safely today, but the one that crashes is the one that is going to make the news. Now, so basically we emphasise the aberration, not the most likely thing to happen. It's why everyone got so scared of dying of COVID during COVID, because we talked about COVID deaths front and centre all the time, where actually for everyone under the age of 50, your chance of dying of COVID is really unusual. Same with vaccines. Your chance of dying of a vaccine side effect, it's possible, but it's not probable. So I think when you see things on the news that rattle you, Dreamworld roller coaster accident, young people dying from COVID vaccines, anyone dying from COVID, terrorist attacks, gun massacres, whatever, it helps to remind yourself the reason I'm seeing this on the news is because it's unusual and it is the least likely thing to happen to me. It could happen to me, but it almost certainly won't.
Again, I think a very comforting thought. And also for me, it was a good reminder, because a lot of times people say, oh, well, can the news just stop being so negative? She actually talked a little bit about why it's important that they do focus on those sort of rare and worst and rarest things that happen.
Yeah, of course, those worst and rare things, we don't want them to become commonplace. So shining a light on those things often means that they don't, and that's an important function of the news too.
Yeah, I highly recommend that Lee Sales interview. I feel like I just really settled into that. I think it's nearly an hour long, but it doesn't feel like it. That was certainly the feedback we got from our audience as well. Before we move on, the other thing that perhaps caught me off guard is how optimistic they were for the future of the news industry. I mean, you'd want to be when you work in it, and we certainly are as well. Claire Stutchbury in particular, she's the CEO of the Local and Independent News Association. Just to give you some information, and this is in the interview as well, but just to tie this together, the stresses and challenges facing news media have resulted in the closures of 150 news outlets since 2019, most of those at a local news level. That's an acceleration. This is according to ACCC data that said there were just 106 closures in the decade before that. So it's not a great outlook for local news, but she is still hopeful. And in particular, here she is on attracting younger audiences to local news.
I think there's a really good opportunity around that, actually. And I think because I think there's a lot of younger people who are a little bit tired of the news, right? And I think partly that's about the way it's being presented, right? So we're seeing some really interesting reporting going on, I think, in the local news space that does actually respond to what audiences are telling them, because the reporters who are working in this space are being told what their community want all the time, right? So I think what we're seeing out of that is a really kind of personalised sort of news services evolve, not just about news personalisation in terms of tailored content for individuals and looking at individual preferences through the data, but also just that kind of personable type of reporting, which is still public interest journalism in a lot of spaces. But interestingly, I think once we're able to engage more of the younger audience, they're the people who, I guess, have grown up with subscription TV more so than older generations who are used to having things for free. Their data is showing us that younger people are more willing to pay for a subscription.
I also loved how she gave me some really practical examples, Claire, of some strong local news outlets. So you will have to listen to the episode to find out who those are. But when it comes to local news, we also asked you, our audience, if you feel you get the local news you need. Most said no.
Yeah, and that's a sentiment that's really echoed across all of the data that we see on that question. The appetite for local news is absolutely there, but the business model is very, very tough.
Yeah, I didn't get any answers on how we improve the business model for media in any of the interviews, although there's a lot of searching and, as I said, a lot of hope. Takeaway number 3, I didn't expect the COVID-19 pandemic to come up so much.
Yeah, this is something that you and I have talked about quite a bit since you started doing the Newsmakers interviews, because so many of your guests referenced it. Dr. Karl spoke about how we knew about the virus, how we were responding to it changed, and there was much more pointed commentary as well, both from Chris Uhlmann and Lee Sales, on why we haven't questioned the response more deeply.
We were the police force for the government. You know, it was that all of these people who were complaining about vaccine mandates, and look, you know, I said before the whole thing began, if there's a vaccine and it's efficacious and safe and you don't take it, you're an idiot. Because I had 2 uncles who had polio, so, you know, and saw one who was crippled for life, right? the polio vaccine was a miracle.
Game
Vaccines are a miracle. So but that said, I can understand why someone might have an issue with that and decide that they don't want to do that. It's not for me to judge them. You know, when the government basically says it's going to take your job off you if you don't get vaccinated, well, that's a pretty big call. Now, is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. But I shouldn't become the police force for that.
Yeah, you mentioned Lee Sales as well, Claire. When I asked her what she considered to be the current most overlooked news story, she spoke about the pandemic also.
I think our Australia's response to the COVID pandemic, because that was so life-changing for so many people, the policy responses that we adopted. And pretty much by the time we got to the end of the pandemic, everyone was tired of hearing about it. And so I'm not persuaded that we've actually had a proper examination of what are the long-term costs of the policies that we adopted and why did we choose that path. And so, you know, I think that that's something that should be looked at, because we don't know when there could be another pandemic coming down the track. And every time I see a news story talking about, you know, mental health issues, children's education issues, or I think back to people that I interviewed on the program during that period, like people whose parents were in aged care and how we handled aged care. I feel like we have not done enough to get to the bottom of that. The way media covered it, the way politicians handled it, the reliance on epidemiologists and chief health officers. I just think the whole response across the whole area needs a really, really close, deep dive look.
She did add, Claire, that I said to her immediately, well, are you going to do it? You know, are you going to be the person to lead the charge? She said she'd run out of steam to do that. But it's an interesting observation, and certainly one that she was very keen to plant on our radar. Any journos you see out there who might have the energy?
I really don't. I think like so many of us, we just want to move on from those times. But yeah, there's certainly lots of questions about, of all the things that have happened in the last few years, shouldn't we spend a bit more time actually reflecting on how we responded to that crisis? Because again, learning lessons of the past is really important to do.
It is important to do, but looking backwards is not something we find particularly easy. Coming up, we're going to talk a little bit about the things that we asked of you throughout this series and what you thought. Longtime squizzers know we're fans of Zoe Foster-Blake, so partnering with her skincare brand Go2 was an easy choice. Go2 does what it says on the tin. It's luxe skincare that works without putting stress on your wallet. Find your Go2 at go2skincare.com. When it comes to skincare, you shouldn't have to choose between the stuff that works and what you can afford. That's why we've partnered with Go2. There's no baffling science, no fluff with Australia's go-to for skincare. Just seriously effective products that make your skin and wallet happy. Level up your routine at go2skincare.com. Each week, alongside the Newsmakers podcast episode, we put out a newsletter. It went to 60,000 odd people, and we know many, many of you listening have probably read it and probably answered some of the poll questions that we had in there. We ask questions like, do you get enough local news? How often do you seek out business news? What do you think is the most overlooked news story? We also ask, do you think about Western values like democracy and freedom? The big questions.
It's not small talk, is it?
No, I wouldn't have thought so. I think we did ask about how many gold medals you think we might win at the Olympics. I think we gave people some reprieve.
But yeah, very, very big questions, which is a bit like us. We don't do a lot of small talk even in our daily lives. But look, we got thousands of responses and hundreds of comments, and we shared quite a few of them with you over our Instagram. But it was your response to the latter that really stuck with me. And look, I know that we care a lot about Australia and these big conversations as a nation, but it was your response really to the latter that struck us.
Yeah, that question about, do you think about Western values like democracy and freedom? Nearly 100% of you, hundreds of you that responded to that poll said, absolutely, I do. So we know these big, thoughtful issues are top of mind for you. Across the series, we also received plenty of feedback which we welcome. The vast majority of it was positive, which we particularly welcome. Some people expressed views about a guest we had or disagreed with an opinion expressed, but at least people were thinking about it. And even in those negative comments, it was always with some sort of, constructive criticism. Should we put it that way?
Squizzes are like that.
They are. Like, we didn't love this, but, here's a suggestion, and don't worry, we still like you and we're still going to listen to everything you do. So appreciate that. Revisit what I said at the top, though. We wanted to make you think, which is why we asked what you enjoyed most about this series. It was really important that we asked you that question. The top answer was that I learnt something, which made me incredibly happy.
Yeah, and I think I know why, because it's just really important for us personally. We want to be providing you with content that does make you think about the big things. We're not light and frivolous. We do know that. We do bring these things with our own sense of humour, but we do want to make sure that we do leave you with something that's valuable.
Yeah, the values behind the Squiz are really that we know you're smart, we know you can make up your own mind, but you're also curious like I am, which is why I enjoyed doing this so much. Which brings me to the next series, Claire. We're cooking it up. It's coming in a few weeks. In the meantime, plenty of ways to stay involved in News Club. On Mondays, Claire, you write our News Club newsletter. I cannot recommend that highly enough. It's about memes this week.
It's about memes this week. It's a whole thing. I like spending the weekend, like so many squizzes, and I know you do too, Kate, going through the papers, consuming all that thoughtful information in those longer reads, whether they're opinion pieces or whether they're just deeper dives. So picking a topic, see what's bubbling up, sharing with you the things that I read, Kate, that you read, what we watched, what we listened to, the things that are just really helpful in those what we call club picks to bring those different perspectives to life.
As I said, this week was all about political memes. The week before, I think it was about the whole mis and disinformation debate. You had a really good newsletter on the US election and the US politics. If you're not signed up to that newsletter, I highly recommend going to our website, popping your email address in, and you'll be signed up.
And you know what, Kate? We're also shortlisted for a prize for that newsletter with Mumbrella. So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed for that. You can collect that. You're going to that event this week. That'll be good. You can follow us on socials to find out if we won that award. We might tell people that way. If you don't hear anything about it, means we didn't.
Probably didn't.
And of course, Claire, every Saturday morning, our weekly podcast show, Weekly Wrap, drops where we discuss the week in news and what's coming up. On that note, have a great week and we'll be back on Saturday.